and hopefully he can join us. Okay. It is 5:32. I call this meeting of the Flint Historic District Commission to order. It is September 2nd at 5:32. If we could have a roll call vote.
Commissioner Davis.
Present.
Commissioner Wright.
Here.
Commissioner Scapani.
Here.
Commissioner Bernash.
Here.
Commissioner Niswander.
Here.
Commissioner Hurley.
Here.
Have a quorum.
Okay, and moving on to the next agenda item, the Member Remote Announcement Open Meetings Act. City Attorney Gurley.
Sure. All boards and commissions must adhere to all laws established under the Michigan compiled laws and in accordance with the revisions of the Open Meetings Act adopted in Senate Bill 1108 as passed on October 13th, 2020 and signed into law on October 16th, 2020. A public announcement shall be made by each member who is attending the meeting remotely that he or she is attending the meeting remotely, and except for those in military service, stating his or her physical location.
Okay, if we could go through the roll call again.
You're on mute, Bill.
Commissioner Davis.
Commissioner Davis attending remotely, City of Flint.
Commissioner Wright.
Commissioner Wright attending remotely. I'm in Troy, Michigan.
Commissioner Scapani.
Commissioner Scapani attending remotely from Flint, Michigan.
Commissioner Bernash.
Commissioner Bernash appearing remotely from Flint, Michigan.
Commissioner Niswander.
Commissioner Niswander attending remotely from Flint. Excuse me.
Commissioner Hurley.
Mike Hurley attending remotely, Flint, Michigan.
Okay. And next item on the agenda, additions or changes to the agenda. Does anyone have any additions or changes to the agenda? Hearing none, if we could have a motion to adopt the agenda.
Motion to adopt the agenda as proposed.
And is there support?
On support.
Okay, we have a motion with support. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
No.
Hearing none, the agenda is adopted. Moving on to the next agenda item, minutes of the previous meeting and disposal from August 5th. I believe it should be 12 pages long. If y'all could just take a moment to review the proposed minutes. And is there a motion?
I make a motion to approve the minutes.
And is there support for that?
Or
We have a motion with support.
Commissioners,
Any discussion?
sorry, Chairperson Bernash, can
Yes.
the commissioners who make a motion also state their names?
Certainly.
Thank you.
So who made the motion?
Commissioner Scapani.
Okay, and who is supporting?
support by Niswander.
Okay. And any discussion?
No.
Hearing none. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed?
No.
Hearing none, the meeting minutes are approved. Next item on the agenda, hearing from the public. This is where anyone from the public can speak about any topic that is not already currently on the agenda. And so if you want to speak about something that's on the agenda, you wait until we get to that point in the agenda and then you can speak on that topic. So is there anyone from the public that would like to speak about any topic not on the agenda? Hearing none, we will move on to the next agenda item, certificates of appropriateness, notices to proceed. We have none, so we are done. That was quick and easy. Next item on the agenda is old business, and we have the Michigan Historic Preservation Network training, which is scheduled for tonight. The Michigan Historic Preservation Network is here with us, Mallory Bauer, and she has found a trainer, Mike Kirk, who's going to be giving us our training this evening. Mallory, I didn't know if you wanted to introduce Mike or if you wanted to just dig right into the training, but we are ready to go. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction, Heather. I will just briefly remind everybody who we are and my name before I let Mike dive into the training. My name is Mallory Bauer, and I serve the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. And we are the statewide nonprofit who educates and advocates on behalf of historic preservation throughout the state. And conducting these trainings is one of our key educational components. So we're really pleased to be back here with you today. We had Sharon Ferraro at the beginning of the year, was it January or February? And now we're gonna do a deep dive. It'll be about 1 hour with questions on infill construction and what you as commissioners should be thinking about when infill construction applications come before your commission. I do want to just say that this public education programming is brought to you. It's supported by an award from the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs and a grant from the Michigan Preservation Fund of the Michigan Historic Preservation Network and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So I do want to acknowledge our funders who are able to bring this to you all today. Mike Kirk is our instructor today. I've worked with him on many a presentation. He is a very knowledgeable architect who has worked with historic buildings and new buildings as well. And I always learn something new when I hear him present. So Mike, without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to you to start your presentation. And if you want to get your screen shared one as well.
Sure, I'll try that right now. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, there we go. All righty, well, I work with Newman Smith Architecture in downtown Detroit and Southfield. We do work around the state of Michigan as well as retail work around the country. I've been a registered architect in Michigan since the mid-70s and basically practiced from downtown Detroit during most of that time. I'm a certified historical architect through the Secretary of Interior standards through Department of Interior. And I guess I'm starting to resemble the old buildings that I work on. So today's presentation is about how you folks consider new buildings that people are proposing within your historic district. And I hope to be able to give you a little bit different understanding of that mission by the time we get through this presentation. So with new construction, we are talking about both new buildings in between existing buildings, and also any additions or changes to existing buildings. They're going to be altered, pursuant to the secretary standards, and we want to promote sensitively making these changes. Let me see something here. I'm going to try and, there we go. I wanted to be able to see all the writing on my screen. So what the secretary standards for rehabilitation address is the concept of compatibility. And you can see the language there about all the exterior features, and it says the new work shall be differentiated from the old and will be compatible with historic material, feature, side scale, etc., and its environment. Now, what does that mean? Well, differentiation can mean several different things. For one, there can be an obvious division. In fact, the Secretary Standards encourages owners and architects to propose contemporary designed buildings and additions that pick up what I refer to as urban design characteristics from the historic architecture. The differentiation might also be very subtle changes, maybe using the same materials and same geometric layout as the existing building. But I'm just making the point that we're not trying to replicate historic details. That actually is frowned upon by the Department of Interior. So what do you have to go through in order to make these changes? In most communities, there's a planning commission, a zoning board, and yourselves, the Historic District Commission. And you really need to check in with your city government and understand what order of consideration these projects would go through. Since I practice primarily in downtown Detroit, Detroit is considered a certified local government, so it has its own staff and an historic designation advisory board. And the way that the process operates there is we would normally meet with the staff of the Historic District Commission when we're first starting a project, so that we kind of give them a feeling for how we're approaching the project and what our thoughts are on design, and get their feedback so we can incorporate that very early on. And then when we finish the design work in Detroit, we formally submit for site plan review to the Department of Building. And then the Department of Building circulates that application to the HDC, as well as the Planning Commission and all the other city departments. And they will come back and tell us if we have to go through formal site plan approval with the Planning Commission, or if we have to request a variance from the zoning board, or whether the building department itself can issue what's called an administrative review. And then finally, when we present to the Historic District Commission, there's several outcomes that you folks are aware of. And as long as we get a notice to proceed, well, I shouldn't say that, as long as we get a certificate of appropriateness, then all we need to do is, when we send in our building permit, the HDC gets a last look before they'll approve their part of the permit application to do the work. If a demolition was being considered, then we go through the notice to proceed procedure, and we can review that later if you're interested. In the zoning ordinance is where a city or township village would define the external requirements of the site and the buildings that are going to be placed on it, with issues such as setbacks, the massing of the building, the size, the height, any requirements about lot area coverage, coverage of concrete, et cetera, et cetera. And the point being made here is that most of those zoning ordinances occurred sometime past the 1960s. And these historic districts in many cases were conceived before that. And therefore there's probably conflicts, and the HDC may want to formally approach the Planning Commission to ask for variances so that they can enforce, or you can enforce, the aspects of the historic district that may be in conflict with their planning ordinance. Another thing that happens quite often is someone will love the idea of historic architecture, and so they'll go to a magazine and they'll find a stock plan that they buy, and then they'd like to just build it in the district. And the difficulty there is that I'll just say that those plans tend to be idiosyncratic and not necessarily comfortable for modern life, if you will. Victorian homes were divided up into very small compartments, usually with doors in between rooms. Modern living styles tend to want more of an open floor plan. And what we're primarily concerned with for the purview of the Historic District Commission is the exterior of the building. Now, we do have a new state historic tax credit that was passed into legislation last year, and we believe we'll probably be ready for intake of applications sometime next year after they get back through the rulemaking process. And this state tax credit applies to residential buildings as well as commercial. So there would be an opportunity for you to apply for that. The stipulation is that you meet the local commission requirements and/or the National Register requirements. And in those cases, they're also going to be concerned about how you work on the interior of your building. So that's something to be ready for. Now, the biggest difference that I'm teaching over what you might understand are your responsibilities in a historic district is this is not about evaluating architectural styles or your, yes? Hello? Did somebody ask a question? Okay. We're not talking about whether a particular style is being matched or is compatible, but rather we're looking at all of the individual design elements on a site and in a building, which I refer to as urban design characteristics. And the importance of this is that if you get in a controversial situation with your decision and a property owner, that property owner can appeal to the State Preservation Commission and ultimately to the court system. And the decision that you make as a commission, you want that to stand the test of legal review. Making subjective decisions about an extent or appropriateness of architectural style is very difficult to hold up in court, whereas most of the urban design characteristics of buildings tend to be different forms of geometric elements, and you're simply stating that the building does have these items or doesn't have them. So it's a very objective way of evaluating the proposed design. And again, in many cases will be clear enough to be upheld in the legal system. It'd be desirable to have a design professional assist in preparation of the concepts. And although you don't require an architect for buildings, houses below 3,500 square feet, in this case, it's advisable to use someone to help you understand that everything is in proportion and works appropriately. The two pictures here show that even though the house on the top is a prairie style mid-century modern building, and the one on the bottom is a front gable late Victorian probably, they both could have the exact same floor plan. So the appearance of a floor plan and the urban design characteristics of the exterior are not really related. So we're going to look at these urban design characteristics, and many HDCs refer to these as elements of design. In Detroit, they actually have a list, I think about 24 elements that they consider when they review things, and it would be useful for you folks to have a similar list so that you could check them off as you review particular designs. The ones we're talking about today, which are the major ones, are number one, the idea of mass, scale, and form, the overall shape and bulk of the building. Number two, the materials that are used. And number three, the openings in the walls, the windows and doors, and what their orientation is, either vertical or horizontal, and what the rhythm of the openings is, how they're spaced apart, and how they relate to the rest of the block. So for mass, scale, and form, the mass is the overall size and volume of a building. And to the right at the top there, we have a simple two-story building with a front-facing gable and single roof ridge. The scale is the relationship of one object to another object, and that can be between elements on the same building or between the elements on, say, the new building and the existing buildings that surround it. And finally, the form has to do with the shape of the building, which in most cases is defined by the roof plan and or the regularity or irregularity of the floor plan, which results in building walls that go in and out on the house. So again, going to that upper right, you know, with that simple two-story form, down in the lower left, we've just indicated a false gable going across the front, and then we've continued to keep that shallow roof pitch behind it. And in this case, we're moving towards a Tudor type building form. And then right next to it on the right, instead of the simple acute angle gable, we have what's called a gambrel roof detail, which has the two steep vertical slope sides and then two fairly shallow sides at the top, which is the Dutch colonial, and is also used in a lot of barn construction because it maximized the volume that was available to store hay in the hayloft. So now we'll talk about orientation and rhythm. So in both of these houses, you can see that the windows are vertical in character. Each window is separate in the house, except in the bay window on the left, two of the windows are paired together. So that begins to address the rhythm of the openings. If you look at later mid-century modern buildings, an example would be the Chicago school style. The window combinations, which might have 3 or 5 windows paired together, are a more horizontal window form rather than vertical. So that's the kind of comparison you're trying to make between those openings. Obviously, all the doors will be vertical, but whether the door is a simple door opening or whether it has a transom above it or a side light next to it are also elements that you want to consider. And then, as I said before, in terms of rhythm, with the contemporary building on the right, we can see the pairing of windows and their spacing on the house. And although they're slightly different than the historic building on the left, they tend to have a similar feel to them, or cadence if you were comparing it to a musical score. And that's why we represent that as similar rhythms. So now I'm just going to go through a series of examples and we can kind of talk through what you see there. The house in the center here, brown, darkish brown gray, is set back from the street at a similar point to the houses on either side of it. It's a story and a half house, if you will, with similar form. The hood, the gable hood over the dormer on the front is different than what's used elsewhere. So that's a little bit of a diversion, but essentially it's got paired windows on the front, as does the lighter colored house farther down the street. They are punched openings in the walls. They have trim around the window openings, and at the building corners, it's got a projecting front porch with column structure. And so for all of these, and the materials that it is built out of look to be painted clapboard, which the other buildings are as well. So we would generally say that this is a compatible design and would fit well within that block and in the historic district. Another kind of straightforward example, the building on the right has been built out of modern materials, but the roof form is similar. It too has both a projecting room and projecting porch within that front gable dormer. The dormer is larger than the one next door, but it's of similar geometric configuration. And again, the windows are punched openings with trim. It looks like both of these buildings have painted wood siding. So again, we would tend to think that this is a compatible design as well. Now here we have an historic building in the front, and the room that is right at the front of this house was actually previously a front porch that was then completely enclosed and turned into living space. And the issue here is that although they used similar materials to match the original house, the same painted wood siding, they've eliminated a major urban design characteristic of the house, which was its open front porch and front entry. So if somebody was proposing to build this and the porch was currently there, we would find that this was an incompatible addition and would probably suggest that the homeowner, if they need additional space, consider doing it elsewhere on one of the other facades of the house. And every situation can be slightly different, and you have to take that into account, but this is one way of considering that in just strictly objective evaluation of what would have been there now and what they were proposing to do. Here's a kind of a mixed district with looks like larger, probably flat, existing historic flat housing, as well as on the edge of a commercial district with some higher mixed use buildings behind it. The building in the center are a series of attached townhouses. They have a front facing roof, roof slope, which looks similar to the slope of the historic building to the right. It looks like the sidewall of the new building appears to be brick, which by looking at the buildings beyond it, there is also brick utilized in the neighborhood. And the front of the building has some kind of treated siding on it, which again can be thought of as similar to the painted clapboard on the historic building. So it has punch windows. They're vertical in character. They have a canopy over the front entry porch, as does the historic house. And so again, by ticking off all those different characteristics, you could find a basis for considering the townhouses as a compatible design within that district. And so we've really got a contemporary building next to a very strongly detailed Victorian Italianate historic house, and we find that they can both live comfortably together.
So how do you approach when, especially in the inner city areas where, this is Commissioner Wright speaking, I'm sorry. How do you approach it when they can use the elements such as brick, but they have a very contemporary look because apartments naturally are going to have some type of vinyl windows? I can't imagine that they're going to use a wood window or necessarily, a wood treated siding. So as the commission, do we have the right to push back and say our preference or redesign? Because most of the apartment buildings they are proposing, they all have kind of like a flat roof, which is in no way a resemblance of anything historic.
Right.
I mean,
you do have the purview to oppose that. So if they're going to put a flat roof apartment building in a block, an historic district block, and all of the other structures on that block are slope roof houses, you can request that the developers or owners change the design to incorporate a sloped roof. You can also request the painted wood historic double hung windows. You can substitute other materials for the wood windows. I would, 20 years ago, I would have said that vinyl windows are totally inappropriate, but there are some new composite plastic windows that incorporate fiberglass structure that maintains the appearance, and you can put coatings on them that replicate paint coatings. So the windows, you have a little more freedom, but you can request that the windows in the new building are also double hung windows and not big sheets of unbroken glass. So yes, you have that ability.
thank you for answering that question. Okay, because I always wonder, could we push back even if they get approval from zoning to move forward? How much influence do we have as the Historic Commission to enforce that a redesign can occur, especially with these developers?
Well, there's a good example of why you probably need to have some meetings with the mayor and city government to meet with the zoning, Board of Zoning Appeals and the Planning Commission. And in cases where someone's proposing a new building, I think it would be important in that case to have the Historic District Commission review it first. Because your mission, your purview is to find that compatibility. After they've agreed with those items, then they can go to the Planning Commission and if need be for variances to zoning about the placement of the building on the site and any other zoning restrictions they may have. But if in your community they're going to those commissions first, it really is, I think you're setting yourselves up as a community for a lot of controversy, because like you say, they would approve it and then you have to deny it. Whereas if you approved or denied it first, and then they go to them, the zoning and planning commission do not have the right to overrule you, because the historic district legislation was created through the state. So you're going back to a state backup system.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Sure. And others, please ask questions as I go along. I'll just keep moving until I hear you. So this is an example of an historic building that's been obviously renovated over the years. You can see up at the roof line that there's an overhanging eave and cornice. It has what we call brackets that kind of replicate the wood construction from a Greek temple thousands of years ago, but that was the basis for the design of those brackets. That cornice indicates that originally this was an Italianate commercial building. And then from there, the second story of the building has been covered with vertical siding. Now, the building next door looks like it was originally brick and remains. Probably this building was also brick originally, because many downtowns started to build in brick in the early 20th century to reduce the possibility of fires. Those two bay windows, say that?
Okay.
Was there a question?
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Excuse me, Mr. Kirk, this is Bill Vandercook. Can everyone go ahead and mute their mics while we're doing this presentation? Thank you. Unless you
Okay.
have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the two bay windows on the front look like they're original. And so that would indicate that it was probably a fairly decorative building. And probably that center horizontal window was not there. Was probably a larger, maybe 3 windows joined together. And did someone have a question, or can you mute your microphone? Okay. In any event, the shape of that window is not appropriate, and also the picture framing of molding around those windows.
4 weeks.
Can you please mute your mic? Thank you. In any event, that all of that treatment of the second floor is probably not appropriate. And then there was this false roof. I'm sorry?
Okay, the attorney, Joanne Gurley. Attorney Joanne? Joanne? I'm going to have to put you on mute. We can hear some background noise. Attorney Joanne Gurley? Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that, Mike.
That's fine. So that false canopy roof on the first floor also would not have been there originally. And it's, as you can see, it's really kind of changing the presence of the building. It makes the building look top heavy because the second floor surface is larger than the first floor storefront surface. So that also is inappropriate. And finally, the shape of the windows on the first floor, those were probably originally display windows that went down to, say, a 12 or 18-inch base with interior displays for retail enterprises. So all in all, it's an inappropriate approach. Again, being that it's already there, it's allowed to continue in its state. But if someone presented a design like this, you could do what I just did and go through and develop a checklist of all the items that were not appropriate in order to let the owner know they would have to come back with another design that was more appropriate. Here's an example.
Question. So can I ask a quick question? So just as you pointed out, for those design element changes, what happens if it's not necessarily a developer, but an individual who made or implemented the changes without approval, but they haven't occupied the location or dwelling? Do we accept it as is, or do we make a request for them to make modifications to some appearance of the elevation level or something to fit within a historic district?
Okay, well, there's a couple of layers of issues there. First of all, if they did work without notifying the city and did not pull a building permit, then they're in violation of your building code. And the first thing you would have happen is for the building department to withdraw their certificate of occupancy. And that means they would have no right to use the building. And then at that point, they would be forced to come back to the Historic District Commission. You would evaluate it, tell them what has to be changed. And then in order for them to get a building permit and get a certificate of occupancy, they would have to take off the inappropriate material and rebuild it to meet what your commission came up with. If the other problem might be that somehow the building department issued a building permit on a building without letting the Historic District Commission review it. And that's more of a procedural problem within the city government. So that's again why I would suggest that you have meetings between the city executive and the various commissions, so that you establish a workable order of consideration, and note that the building department would never issue a permit unless it had already sent the plans to HDC for their review and approval.
Okay, thank you again for that clarification. Okay.
Okay, great. So here's a condition like you might find in Lincoln Park in Chicago, or some other very dense downtown neighborhoods that have a lot of what are called walk-up historic apartments. Obviously, the building on the right is another Italianate style 3.5-story apartment building. The building on the left is a very obvious contemporary design, probably apartments above, and looks like maybe office use on the first floor. Not to say you can't build a new building, a contemporary building next to the historic one, but here again, we're not evaluating architectural style, we're evaluating urban design characteristics. So starting at the top of the building, the historic building has a cap to it, a decorative cornice. If we look over the contemporary building, there is no cap or crown. There's simply a layer of stone as a parapet cap on top of the wall. So the contemporary architect could have placed a trim near the top of that building in order to give it a similar type crown, not trying to copy the decorative nature of the Victorian cornice, but rather just suggest that the building had a top to it. Then we come down to the third floor windows, and on the historic building, all of the windows are vertically oriented, they're double hung, and they're punched openings, all separate individual windows. On that third floor, we've got a sliding door or French doors with side lights on it, and then with these large horizontal transom windows above, which have absolutely nothing to do with the historic architecture. The other thing that's happened here from a large scale standpoint is they've chosen to build a planter wall near the front of their site, but it actually is behind the face of the historic buildings. And then the new building itself is set back further from that with a patio. And then the third floor is set back again, forming a deck above the second floor. All of those things really compete with the rhythm and character of that historic neighborhood and kind of flaunt the muscularity of the modern design. So we would say that's not compatible. The form's not compatible. That window configuration on the third floor. On the second floor, it's also horizontal, which is not compatible. And then the first floor is entirely sheathed in glass, which again, in no way is part of the historic character. So again, not judging whether you like the contemporary design or not, but simply ticking off each one of these elements of design or urban design characteristics, you would probably find this design to be incompatible and you wouldn't approve it to be built here. Here we've got several historic apartment buildings with the walk-up first floor apartments in several different styles, Flemish building in the center and Romanesque detailing on the buildings on either side. And then the commercial building on the left side also has Romanesque detailing with the round arches, and they're all brick with some stone and molded brick details in the historic architecture. The new building in the center is a smaller, thinner building. It's taller than the other residential buildings, but shorter than the commercial building. So in that sense, it's a good transition point from the larger commercial to the smaller historic apartment buildings. The windows on the upper floors are punched openings, vertical in nature. There is a cornice shown on the new building, which gives it a top. The picture window on the second floor is out of character, but the first floor looks like it's got a recessed entry, similar to the other buildings, and the glazing on the first floor seems to be a similar scale to the lighter colored building on the right. And the light tone of what might be limestone or other exterior tone is present in the historic architecture in the building on the right. So for those reasons, we would say that this contemporary building does address the urban design characteristics of the neighborhood and therefore would be compatible. Here we have two, probably some kind of institutional buildings that probably a larger owner, multi-building owner has, and we're proposing to put an addition to connect the buildings together. So in this case, the historic building on the right has triplet window configurations, and the new addition between them also has 3 windows together. The building on the left in the bay windows has transom glass above their windows, and the new building shows transom glass in its design. The third floor of the new building has horizontal glazing, which is the shape of the transom glass in the lower 2 levels. A little bit different, but I think the overall composition works. The roof shape has similar roof slopes to the historic buildings, and they've picked a brick that appears to match or go in between the different shades of brown brick that are on the 2 historic buildings. So again, it looks like ticking off those urban design characteristics. You would find this addition, if it was proposed to be built, that it would be compatible with the historic buildings. In this one, we also have 2 historic buildings, most notably look like houses, Victorian houses. And this very contemporary addition has been proposed between them. The addition on the upper floors has paired glass doors with transoms above, which are similar to the transom and paired windows on the front of the building to the right. There's limestone banding on the new building, horizontal banding, which also occurs in both historic buildings. And the entrance to the addition has a recessed entry area and what looks like a covered entry based on that brick fascia wall above and the columns flanking the entry, and would begin to address the same functional use as the decorative Victorian porches on the 2 houses. So again, quite different in architectural style with the modern versus the historic, but for all of those reasons I checked off, again, you could find that compatible. Now that I've said that on all these examples, does anyone feel like that's not appropriate, given what you understand your responsibilities are on the HDC?
I think there were good examples. I think some things we may not necessarily fully agree with, but at least you gave us examples to show how, no matter what, any newer design is going to be more contemporary. But again, thinking very thoughtfully about material selections will clearly make a difference on where we approve it, and just some suggestions if new proposals come forward of what we can make for new construction to make us a bit more aware of the influence that we can have and what we have the ability to enforce to any developer or individual.
That's good. You know, not to say that your personal taste or feelings don't have an effect here. You can certainly voice those things in the discussion, but again, I'm trying to set you up so that however you record your decisions in the decision meeting minutes, that those items are objective observations versus opinions on appropriateness of style or color, etc. One good thing, I don't know if you folks have access to any reference books, but one of the best that I've used for probably 50 years or 40 years anyhow, it's called A Field Guide to American Architecture by a husband and wife team called the McAllisters. And it actually has kind of an alphabet of all different kinds of window forms and roof forms and decoration and other things from, I think, 10 or 15 different styles, including modern architecture. And something like that would also help you evaluate designs when you see them. Here we have a straightforward commercial district, primarily built in brick. The building at the corner is a new building that was built to be compatible. With the limestone inserts at the top of the wall, we get the appearance of a cap or crown on the building, similar to the cornices from the historic buildings down the street. The headers over the windows are limestone, projecting limestone headers, which again are similar to the limestone used on the historic buildings. The windows are in three groups of three. I can't tell what the building is after the next one. It looks like it has grouped windows, but that's a little bit of a diversion. But then the first floor has been clearly articulated as a storefront opening with a transom band, probably structural, which is similar to the second building down the block, along with a colonnade and recessed storefront. So, and the materials and colors also respect the existing environment. So for all those reasons, you could again consider this a compatible addition to that neighborhood.
So I have a question on this one.
Yeah.
So would you put something this size or bigger in a neighborhood with housing, like housing on both sides that set back further?
So I didn't quite get the nature of the question. When you do what?
Let's say we were putting this building here on the corner of a historic district.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit bigger, and instead of business district, it would have houses on the side, on both sides of it, and surrounding it that sat back further.
Okay, well, the issue there, just before we get into any detail, is if the neighborhood is all houses, the size of this building would not be appropriate. But if the neighborhood there's a neighborhood in Detroit called Corktown that's probably the oldest neighborhood in the city from the early 1800s. And it had corner bars and corner stores on a lot of the residential blocks. And there were even some warehouses and small industrial buildings right in the neighborhood. And because of that, we recently proposed some townhouses that actually kept the form of the nearby industrial building more so than the painted wood clapboard houses. And it was approved because it fit in with this mixed character of the neighborhood. But if the whole neighborhood is painted wood clapboard with sloped roofs and somebody wants to build this building at the corner, I don't think you'd be approving it.
Well, the end of the end over by the main road would be your business district in the historic area. And then there's some on the other end down by the river. I mean, those would be appropriate places for it.
So there's a mix of commercial buildings and
On the
sloped
outer
roof.
limits,
Okay, well,
but not
in
in
that
the
case,
middle.
down in the middle of the block.
Right.
Okay, well, in that case, you would, usually when you're doing these comparisons, you should be looking at a whole block front from one side street to the next. And then if you take the proposal for the new building and see it in the context of that overall block, you try and make a decision about whether it's compatible with the average of what you see on the block. And, you know, that's easy to do when there's a lot of historic buildings remaining. If there's two remaining structures on a block of 10 or 15 structures and somebody's proposing something new, it's a little more difficult. But basically your mission as an historic district commission is to compare the new design to whatever's left and make it compatible with those. So you wouldn't say because there's 10 blocks of open space or 10 lots of open space that you wouldn't make this building compatible with the two that are remaining. You try and make it compatible. And, you know, when I say all this, the other thing to remember is this, it does have a cost effect, but there's often a number of different ways to execute the building, which can vary in cost quite a bit depending on the material used on the walls. So you can still achieve an appropriate design and not necessarily spend as much money as what may be on neighboring properties.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Next example, here's one of those little corner commercial situations with a bar underneath that turreted roof. And unfortunately, the bar was probably added after the building was built. Probably that turret either resolved itself with a column down below it at the corner or might have had flanking columns on the sides. But in any event, the first floor was not built out the way this bar is built out. The imposition of the horizontal wood siding also is not found anywhere else on the building or on neighboring buildings in the block. And the horizontal character of the windows with the high sills also doesn't necessarily have precedent. So I think for all those reasons, if somebody was proposing that bar with that storefront, you would not find it compatible. You'd probably recommend that they infill with brick on either side of the entrance and open up the area beneath the turret if possible and recess the entrance. So that's kind of what we used to call a remodeling of a historic building. And I think we're getting close here to the end. This is just an example that you can be compatible with much different types of buildings. So the building on the left, historic building, office use on the upper floors, has had a parking deck built right next to it. And when they created the parking deck, they picked up the bay, a little bit wider bay spacing, which is the structural bays of the deck, but they used curved openings on the top. They're not quite the full round, but they're close to it. And then they've included intermediate columns between the bays to break down the scale and make it appear like the vertical proportion of the original double hung windows on the historic building. So the deck is sheathed with brick. It's a lighter color, but the materials are similar. And even at the top of the deck, they've used a colonnade of those intermediate columns to create a crown or a top on that building. So again, here, for all those reasons, we would consider that deck architecture to be compatible with that building, even though it's a totally different use in the city. And now I think I'm going to show you a wild one. No, well, this is one wild one. I'll show you a couple. Here we've got a couple of 3-story townhouses, and the developer couldn't make a deal to buy the townhouses, so he built around them and above them and totally dwarfed them. And I think you know what the answer is here. It's just simply not appropriate. And when somebody takes that approach and they come to you with a contemporary building and try to say, well, our contemporary building had little tiny elements in it from the historic buildings around it, they've got to watch out that it kind of meets the duck test. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck. Here in downtown Detroit is the new Shinola Hotel project. The red brick building and the 2 limestone buildings on the right are historic buildings. And then the dark brick building, or 2 buildings on the left, are the contemporary addition. Again, the building on the far left, similar window types, first floor storefront. The building in between has got a setback at the 3rd floor, and that doesn't work quite as well, except the second building from the right is only 3 stories high, so there's some precedent for that lower scale building. So all in all, we found it to be compatible within the overall character of the block. And this was the crazy one I wanted to show you. Contemporary architects will come in and try and find all different storylines to tell you how they derived the shape and the materials and the form of that building from the historic, probably courthouse building at the corner. And obviously they don't have anything to do with one another. The contemporary building completely detracts from the character of the historic building, if that was an historic district. And so you would probably reject that design. One small thing in a downtown where they've introduced a balcony on the 2nd floor. They went right over the top of the 2nd floor windows, just below the segmental arches of the Victorian Italianate windows, brought an exposed stair down to the front entrance. And again, for all those reasons, obviously doesn't match anything, and it's not compatible. This is a project I worked on a couple of years ago in Dearborn. That's a 1894 historic hotel in the corner. It actually had the whole 1st floor removed in the 1950s and bricked up. We stripped all that off, found historic photos, replicated the original brick arches and the limestone detailing, redetailed the balconies from the historic photos and restored the turret. And in this case, actually put a roof entertainment deck on top with some very thin guardrail detailing and aircraft cables so that the historic building read through. But then beyond it to the right and wrapping around the back, there's actually a 3-story, 75,000 square foot new building, a single building that Ford Motor Company had 300 IT engineers in the second and third floor, and there's a sister building to our left across the street that did similarly. But we designed them so those big buildings had offsets and the facades were broken up to look more like 20-foot wide storefronts in order to approach the scale of the rest of the downtown architecture. So you can have quite different and quite modern approaches and still make them work. And then, you know, in addition to the elements of design, you probably should have some kind of a description of all these different issues and list what the basis is for your consideration. If you look at the first one, it says compatibility with size, scale, color, material, and character. Many historic district commissions no longer judge the paint color on buildings because paint color can be changed. They're concerned more with the fixed building materials and do not want to get into, again, a subjective discussion about color. That if it becomes really unbelievably inappropriate, both the Planning Commission and the Board of Zoning Appeals can also address color issues on your behalf. Height, you get into issues. We've had a situation in suburbs of Detroit where we affectionately call them McMansions or zoning envelope houses. And what happens is they want to build the biggest building possible on their residential lot. So they fill up the width and the depth and the height of the building, which results in them only putting on a very shallow roof slope on top. And the building ends up looking totally out of character with the rest of the block. And in those cases, we've advised that they can pull down, lower the roof eave so that you have some slope ceiling inside the top floor of the building. And by pulling down that roof eave and increasing the slope of the roofs, you can bring the building more in scale with buildings around it. It's important with the street line that new buildings line up with the properties on either side. And if in the historic buildings, they varied in depth from the street, then you should take the average distance from the street between the neighboring properties and set the new building at that average distance so that the flow of the block front remains the same. The facade composition is everything I've been telling you throughout the presentation. Rhythm and pedestrian experience. It's not only important about the rhythm of windows and doors, but also the rhythm of the overall set of buildings in the block front. And that's where roof shapes, roof slopes, size of front walls, setbacks from the street are all very important in coming up with a compatible block front. And materials and details we've also discussed. So that's the presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions or concerns you folks might have. Here, I'll get rid of the stuff here.
I have a question about, you earlier mentioned, working with the HDC and the zoning department to maybe, well, I don't know how, as an example, if you had a height restriction and but a more compatible response could be a taller roof, or allowing for a variance for beyond the height restriction. Could you use that as the hardship from the HDC to the ZBA, or is that not how you were describing that sort of variance mechanism with the HDC project?
So you're saying that the HDC would require the owner to have the building be shorter, and then the owner would go to the Board of Zoning Appeals to make it taller? Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, like if, say, actually the opposite. If the if a taller roof line or eave line
Uh-huh.
was more compatible with the block, right?
Okay. Yep.
Could you use that as the hardship to get a variance for a height?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you could. And it would be useful, again, if you could have a meeting with the zoning appeals and the planning commission ahead of time and talk through some of these examples to say that, we may be coming back to you or advising an owner to come back to you requesting a variance because we believe they need to modify their design to be more compatible in the neighborhood. And that would be entirely appropriate. And again, if the HDC could review it first and make a decision, then the planning commission may simply accept it and there wouldn't be a need for a variance from the Board of Zoning Appeals, possibly. Or if you required it, the planning commission said no, and then they forced them to the Board of Zoning Appeals. I believe because the HDC legislation also goes to the state, that you would have a valid legal argument to for them to grant the variance.
Thanks.
It's not a simple condition evaluating these things, and obviously people are going to be very emotional about their approach. I live in Dearborn, and we have quite a number of different nationalities in the city, and we've got some very strong historic areas, but the city never established an historic district commission. So we're always debating these issues every time a new house occurs. And one of the things that we've worked through over time is that a lot of the folks, I've done research, and most of the folks that came to Dearborn were from countries around the Mediterranean, southern Italy, southern Poland, and the Middle Eastern countries. And what's amazing is every one of the cities they came from were occupied by the Romans. And so they actually have remains of Roman architecture, and like in Poland and Germany, they use the round Romanesque arch. And I was trying to research historic houses in Lebanon, and the one example they showed in Google is a Roman house of round arch windows and stucco or mud bases. So when they work in our historic neighborhoods, most of our houses are European type styles. And what they would like to do is use very oversized architectural details. Like they might put a balustrade around the front porch, but instead of it being out of metal, painted metal, or even wood with thin spindles, they would build a limestone balustrade, and the spindles would be 6 inches in diameter, and the newel posts would be 12-inch square piers. And obviously, there was a very stark contrast between those elements and the original. Most of them were 1.5 story red brick kind of Cape Cod houses. And what's occurred over time is we've had discussions within the community when people bring these forward and say, well, would you consider just downsizing the proportion of what you're building a little bit? And I think it'll end up working much better within the neighborhood. And we're working our way there. I mean, there have been changes, but I just use that example to say that it's not easy from a community or emotional standpoint, passing judgment on some of this stuff. And the other thing that comes into play is property rights, and you don't want to discriminate against different cultural expressions. So that's why I keep harping on, it's not about style, it's about urban design characteristics, because that can be an objective discussion. Well, I guess we're set, Mallory.
Yeah, I have a few things to wrap up with. If anybody thinks of any questions, feel free to ask them. I did put in the chat the Field Guide to American Houses by Virginia Savage McAllister. It has several editions, so if you're interested, the older editions are usually relatively inexpensive on like Amazon. You can find them used. Additionally, if you would like more examples of decisions that come before commissions, we do have a webinar from February that was a back and forth dialogue between two people discussing various applications that have come before commissions throughout the United States, not just Michigan, and comparing them to the standards. What do the standards mean to you? So you can find us on YouTube if you search Michigan Historic Preservation Network. And we have a lot of other webinars that might be useful as you're thinking of things that you want to learn about preservation, from, you know, the energy efficiency of wood windows to brick projects, to, you know, the historic tax credits that are available. So I encourage you to check those out as you continue to educate yourself as commissioners. There were several infill and new construction examples in that webinar, which is what made me think of it when we were discussing things today. And, you know, going back to what Sharon was talking about at our basic training at the beginning of the year, right? As commissioners, it's not our language like I like this style or I don't like this style. Like that is not your responsibility as a commission. You're looking at the application that is before you and looking at the district, looking at the mass, the setbacks, how it would fit into the neighborhood, and then providing, you know, guidance on what does and does not follow the Secretary of Interior standards for that application. Infill does get tricky, right? Because we all have an architectural style that we might want to see on a building that's being built in our district. But if the owner or the person who's applying is choosing a different architectural style, that is their prerogative. They can do that. So we just have to be like, that's another thing to be careful about as we're talking about infill discussion, infill construction conversation. So we are here at MHPN if you have any questions to follow up. Did anybody think of anything that they want to ask Mike before we wrap up today? Mike, do you have any last words, like your parting thought? If one thing we take away from the presentation today and you know, the difficulty that often comes with being a commissioner, what would you say?
Well, I did mention that you don't necessarily need to spend as much money replicating high quality materials that might be on the historic building. And so, you know, we've used things like horizontal hardy board planks to replicate clapboard, which also gives you very good fire prevention. And you can even use half bricks. I don't like to suggest that because you can do it in a retail condition because retail storefronts tend to change fairly often, but there's even the ability to do that. And it's better to get the appearances to work and try and work with people's budgets so that progress actually happens. Although owners are going to plead lack of budget, and that really isn't part of your decision. You're making your decision based on the visual evidence, and then they have to figure out how to execute it to meet your decision and also preserve their budget. So there's many ways to skin a cat, I guess, is what I'm saying. And you just have fun with it.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. Thank you all for attending. I usually begin my introduction by thanking you for the work that you do as a commissioner. It is a volunteer service to your community. It is not easy, and it takes time often to learn and stay on top of things. So I just want to say, thank you for the work that you are doing and the passion you are bringing your community and serving in this role. So at our website, www.mhpn.org, we always have new educational opportunities. If you want to check out our website or follow us on social media, we are here to be a reference for you all. So thank you again, and I will turn it over to our chair, Heather, for wrapping up the meeting.
Well, thank you so much, Mallory and Mike. We appreciate all the help and assistance, technical support and information that you guys are providing to us. Thank you for being here tonight. So moving on to our next agenda item is new business. Does anyone have any new business to discuss tonight? Okay, hearing nothing, the next item on the agenda is the adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn. This is Commissioner Scapani.
Is there support?
Commissioner Davis support.
Okay, we have a motion with support. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. We are adjourned. Thank you all so much for attending tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.